This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
All right, Peter Hall, thank you very much for joining me again on Social Europe Podcast. It's been unbelievably 7 years since we last talked about the topic that we're also going to discuss this evening, which is populism and the rise of populism in Western democracies. And 7 years ago, we talked about the economic and the cultural driving forces behind populism. But since you've also published research about perceptions of fairness and economic uncertainty and how those contributed or have contributed to the rise of populism. So could you maybe pick up where we left it 7 years ago and sort of add your new insights into the discussion about the rise of populism?
Yes, certainly. I mean, this is a moving target, right? And indeed a growing target. So I think that these are important issues. And what I can tell you about is based on some joint research with Song-In Kim at Harvard, where we've been looking across European countries and considering how we might move beyond, as you say, the standard interpretations. And of course, there's a lot in those interpretations. I mean, I think the standard view has been that some kind of material deprivation, maybe caused by a China shock, loss of manufacturing jobs and the like, has been driving support for right populist parties in particular, or to, as Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart argued, this cultural backlash against the popularity of what they call post-material values. And I think those are both, to some degree, have merit. Those views certainly have merit. But what Song-In and I have been thinking about is the way in which that perspective neglects issues of fairness. If you think about it, yes, of course, politics is about who gets what, when, where, and how, as the famous saying goes. But politicians themselves articulate various kinds of moral visions, right? And at the heart of a lot of those moral visions for decades, centuries really, have been issues of fairness. So social democratic parties have typically argued not just, well, we'll do more for you, but they've argued for social justice. We'll provide social justice. We'll advance social justice. And on the political right as well, you know, tax cuts and deregulation are often justified on the grounds that this will allow those who put in effort to reap the rewards of that effort. A kind of, we too are providing something that's fair, right? But oddly enough, the very large literature now on support for right populist parties has not really paid much attention to the question of whether support is based on people's feelings of unfairness. And so with our recent research, and indeed there are now some others engaging in that as well, we're trying to argue that, or examine at least, the notion that people support parties on both the radical left and the radical right because of their feelings that the situation, their situation, or their society's situation is fundamentally unfair. I think that's the first, if you like, somewhat new development in thinking about right populism. There's a second new development, which doesn't begin with us, although we explored as well, which is the notion that what people are worrying about is not simply how poorly they're doing at the moment, either in terms of jobs or in terms of income or the like, but they're actually motivated by uncertainty about how well they'll be doing, how well society will be doing in the future. So these issues of uncertainty have become increasingly important. There's now a very interesting literature which suggests that people who may have a perfectly good job, but a job that's exposed to automation, exposed to artificial intelligence, or simply the kind of automation we associate with digital technologies, that people whose jobs are exposed to that kind of automation, a possibility they might lose that job, might be done by, a machine or some equivalent of that in the future. They too have a tendency to support the radical right. So on the one hand, issues of fairness have, I think, become important here. And I think issues of uncertainty, how people feel the future is going to develop, turn out to also be even more important, actually, than someone's own material circumstances for what kind of party they'll support.
And this kind of notion of uncertainty about the future, I mean, it's just anecdotal evidence, but the velocity of technological change itself seems to be accelerating at an ever faster pace, and more and more diverse groups potentially being affected. I mean, a few years back when we talked about the digital revolution and jobs and automation, it was basically sort of the lorry drivers and, cars, self-driving cars. Now with the rise of generative AI, we are suddenly talking about creative works and people who were previously not worried about their role, or that their role could possibly be automated in one way or the other. So in that sense, the velocity of change and the breadth of change seems to be spreading, which then could, contribute to this very hard to pin down feeling of, uncertainty about the future, and especially at the time, when mainstream political parties don't seem to have convincing answers about how to shape this future. There's probably also an element of control that you can see also in these populist events that we talked about a few years back, with Brexit and also migration waves and so on and so forth. People feel that they've lost control. Do you see connection between, this uncertainty and that kind of loss of control and the sort of inability of mainstream political parties to provide a clear-cut vision for the future? Because for better or worse, and mostly for worse, the reaction seems to be to parrot some of the elements that the populists have basically put into the political discussion and making it mainstream, rather than presenting an own vision about how to actually shape this uncertain future.
Well, of course, I mean, as you say, the truth of the matter is that we do face a very uncertain world. Yeah, maybe 7 years from now, it'll be an avatar interviewing me rather than you, Henning. We don't really know. And there's no question that people are worried. What's interesting about this, to my mind, is the question of, well, why should uncertainty about the future lead to support for populist right parties, right, rather than, let's say, center-left parties or maybe even radical left parties? And there, I think if we look at the work in social psychology, we see some really interesting findings. It turns out that when people feel uncertain, or say in these psychological experiments, when they're primed to feel uncertain, suddenly they become more attentive to issues of unfairness. So there's a mutually reinforcing relationship between, economic uncertainties in particular, and people's tendency to worry that their own situation may be unfair. They may be being treated unfairly. They will be treated unfairly. So that's one key relationship. The other finding out of psychology about uncertainty is that uncertainty leads people to attach more importance to their own in-group, to become defensive about the situation of their in-group, right? And therefore more hostile, more apprehensive about out-groups. And of course, the classic out-group in our society are immigrants, and it's immigrants who are the target, in many cases, most cases really, of populist right politicians. So this relationship is between uncertainty and a tendency to move towards a populist right is the really interesting causal chain there, as far as I can see it. I have a friend, a psychologist at Northwestern, who shows people pictures of robots and then asks them about their views about immigrants. And it turns out that if you prime people to think about robots, they become, or they evince, more hostility to immigrants. And at one level, that doesn't seem to make sense, right? But there is this connection between feeling that the world is out of control, your own future is endangered in some way. There's no way to stop that. That in turn leads people to become defensive in all sorts of ways and to become very concerned about whether their situation is fair or unfair.
And the immigration issue is very particular in a few respects. I mean, again, anecdotal evidence here from Europe that people can basically at the same time have the view that, they're against refugees, but accept the fact that the economy is facing a shortage of labor and that this shortage can only be filled by more immigration. So it really also depends on the context in which the debate about immigration is being held. What the reaction seems to be, at least that's my impression. Does that fit with your research results, or?
Yes, I think so, and with the general results in the field as a whole, it is of course the great paradox that our Western societies need immigration in order to continue to prosper. Some people argue that the American economy has done relatively well in the last few years since the COVID epidemic, precisely because it's taken in so many immigrants. But there's a way in which people's thinking about immigration is not sort of built on that kind of rational economic calculus. It's more emotional. And I think that's a very important feature of the current situation, which again, people in my field need to pay more attention to. There's an emotional quality to this politics, which is apparent in the appeals of populist right politicians, and is manifest in just what you described, the way in which people react to immigration, not as the solution to some emerging economic problem, but rather as a threat to their own identity, to the culture with which they're familiar. So that if we try to analyze this politics entirely in material terms, even though material issues matter, if we try to analyze it entirely in material terms, we miss the emotional overtones and the emotional quality of both the appeals of the politicians and the responses of many people. My own responses as well. I react to some of this emotionally myself.
And it just with the observation that quite a few commentators have here in Europe, that at the beginning, the first level of trying to address the populist challenge was with policy, right? So you can develop solutions to specific problems, more or less, that might work or might not work. But there's pretty much a general consensus here right now that policy is not on its own is not going to solve. It might be a contributing factor, but it's not going to solve the issue. If you look at recent elections here in Germany in particular, we've seen that politics is coming to the end. I mean, in the state where I'm actually sitting right now, in Brandenburg, we had a very popular prime minister, incumbent for 2 terms, who basically said, look, if you want me to stay, my party has to come first. Mm-hmm. So otherwise I'm gone. So, and he won by a whisker. So that politics strategy has worked probably for the last time. In Saxony, it's worked as well. In Thuringia, it hasn't worked anymore. Mm-hmm. So we're coming to the end of what politics can deliver too. So, and what really leaves what you mentioned just now, and what we also talked about 7 years ago, the kind of cultural war that is underlying this. But if I understand your research correctly, you've understood a bit more about the root causes, what underlies this cultural distinction. It's the uncertainty about the future and how this sort of permeates through the emotional states of people and, into their behavior. And interestingly, you also found out that the support for right-wing and left-wing populism differs, in terms of how it is being generated. Could you maybe expand on this a little bit?
Yes, of course. Song Yin and I look at 13 European countries, and we distinguish between what we call personal unfairness, that is to say, people's feelings that their own situation is unfair. We thought about that. We looked at that in terms of whether they thought the job opportunities available to them were fair or unfair, whether their current income was fair or unfair. So we distinguish between personal unfairness, how I feel about my own situation, and social unfairness, how I feel about whether the situation of others in society, their job opportunities, the distribution of income, whether those are fair or unfair. And not surprisingly, people who feel that there's a good deal of social unfairness in the distribution of income or of jobs, those people are drawn to the radical left, and sometimes to the center left. The difference between the radical left and the center left support in our surveys, at least, are that young people, the unemployed, those with very low incomes are more often drawn to the radical left, and older people, somewhat more affluent, tend to be who feel society is unfair, tend to be drawn to the center left. But the really striking fact is that people who feel that their own situation is unfair are much more likely, on the one hand, to be hostile to immigration, and on the other hand, to support populist right parties. It's almost the mirror image. Personal unfairness generates a kind of defensiveness, a set of concerns that open people up to the appeals of populist politicians, whereas feelings of social unfairness really bring support to either the radical left or the center left. And we were, very struck by how stark that difference is. The results are reported in an article in Comparative Political Studies.
And did you also look at different age cohorts? I mean, what is a really worrying trend here recently is that that seems to be the case in recent German elections, but also in Austrian elections, that the young people in particular, who used to be liberal voters, green voters, right? They have really moved towards the radical right, and it's not what sometimes is what was called, reported here, that it's sort of old people with a past in the GDR in Germany. That these were the people, the older, now pension age people with a history in the German Democratic Republic. These were the people that prevented the worst in the Eastern German states. And that seems to be the case in Austria as well, where a lot of young people voted far right. So is this again that maybe the feeling of personal injustice and personal unfairness is very much concentrated also among the youth, or do you have does your research support an explanation for this empirical finding?
Our research doesn't really answer that question. And I think that in general, political science doesn't yet have a very good answer to it. I mean, there are various conjectures out there. One of the more plausible is that older people have been socialized into a party system where they have some loyalty, maybe vestigial loyalty, to a social democratic party or a Christian democratic party. And that inoculates them to some degree against the appeals of these new parties on the far right or the far left. Whereas young people do not. I mean, they were born into a world where these parties, to some extent, already existed, or at least, the notion that, if you're from Bielefeld, you should be a social democrat is not something that the young people feel so strongly about. So that's one conjecture here. I mean, the other big conjecture would be something to do with the economic situation of the young. I mean, I think it's not coincidental that we find high levels of support among the young for populist right parties in Southern Europe and in countries where youth unemployment is particularly high. I mean, that would be a case in France, for instance, as well. A lot of people in their 20s are trapped in these temporary jobs where it's very difficult to move into regularized employment with some kind of employment protection. And I think that could well be true in Germany as well, where we know there is this very stark dual labor market. And, if you get caught on that secondary labor market, it can be very difficult to get into that well-protected job. So it could be, those are two possible reasons why we're seeing the young move towards these populist right parties. But I haven't seen good research on that. And I don't think our data shows that the young are more likely to feel their situation is unfair than the old. I think it's going to be something else that is operating here. But there's no question that pensioners or would-be pensioners like myself, well, the world is uncertain for me, but it's much more uncertain for someone who's 21 years old, seeking an educational qualification, uncertain whether that qualification is still going to be valuable in a world of technological change. I think the young face an unusually uncertain world. And so it wouldn't surprise me if our findings about the importance of uncertainty for populist right support play a role in drawing young people towards these parties.
And, we've established a strand that we had years ago about the elements of cultural and economic reasons for why populists are on the march. You've added this new layer of uncertainty and personal perceptions of injustice. We've also established that there's no good research yet why a particularly worrying recent trend has emerged, i.e. the young flocking towards populist parties. Putting this all together, how, what would your diagnosis about the health of Western democracies be?
Well, it could be better. Obviously, we know that in East Central Europe, the health of democracy is deeply threatened. And, Poland until recently, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, these are cases where I think we have to worry very seriously about the erosion of democracy. Hungary, I guess, would be the poster child for this under Viktor Orban. They show us how it's possible for an elected government to gradually undermine civil society institutions, a free press, the judiciary, in ways that make it very difficult for the opposition to subsequently win an election, for instance. In Western Europe, I'm somewhat more sanguine than some. I'm, of course, worried about the growing popularity of populist right parties, but those parties have been, in many instances, in coalition governments or supporting governments for some time. We have a certain track record there. The results turn out to be very bad for immigrants, but not necessarily for democracy. So I'm not deeply pessimistic about the fate of democracy in Western Europe, at least. Where I think there is a more durable set of effects, and this would apply to the U.S. as well as to all of Europe, the durable effects, I think, follow from two developments. One is the growing social divisions that are fostered by the rhetoric of populist right politicians. And the second development that I think is consequential is a kind of the erosion of norms that kept political rhetoric and political action within a certain set of boundaries. I mean, the American case is really in some ways, the most extreme Western case, at least, of this at the moment. Whether or not Donald Trump wins the next election, and anybody who claims they can predict that seems to me to be overconfident. He might well, he might not. But whether he does or not, already the norms of political discourse in which people would, in some sense, turn away from candidates who were manifestly seen to be lying or using ultra-inflammatory language, those norms seem to have fallen away for a large part of the American population. And similarly, this rhetoric, which we have certainly seen elsewhere in Europe as well, which demonizes immigrants, raises questions about people of other religions or ethnicities, I think that leaves lasting social scars, if you like, on the polity, whether or not the politicians using that rhetoric end up in office or not. So now, is that a threat to democracy? I think it makes democracy less healthy. I don't think it necessarily leads to the collapse of democracy, but it's certainly worrisome for the trajectory of politics in the coming years.
And against this very, very difficult backdrop, I mean, what can mainstream parties, be it Christian democratic parties or social democratic parties, what can they do in order to try to, change the direction? I mean, one element seems to be, we talked about policy at the beginning. I've just come out of a 5-year stint in government, and there's a widespread perception, and the perception is actually true. The public administration is not delivering on the big challenges of society. There's also a lot of empiric evidence of a loss of trust in government. So one part of the equation certainly needs to be that governments need to become more capable again in actually addressing some of the grievances people have and actually delivering measurable results. So at least in Germany and in many other European countries, the perception is that the big problems are growing. The backlog of unresolved issues is growing as well, and nobody's doing anything. And in Germany, in particular, the federal government just gets into fight every time about whatever the issue of the week is. So, but the permanent situation is there's always a fight amongst the parties in government, but nothing ever gets really done. So that's one part of it. But what would you say that parties in general more broadly have to offer in order to change course?
Well, I'm smiling because you speak like a disillusioned bureaucrat, Henning. But
maybe I am one.
possibly realistically so. I do think that there have been some big missed opportunities. And I think, one thing that Germany and the United Kingdom share is, there was this long period of very low real interest rates, which would have been perfect for borrowing, for public investment. And both countries really missed that boat in a big way. And of course, we're paying the costs because public services are fraying. The roads are less good than they used to be. The hospitals are in trouble and the like. And we know that matters because we know that the quality of public services matters quite a lot to the voting population. And it's really in areas where those services are declining that we're more likely to see support for the populist right in particular. Where the local hospital is closed down because they can't be funded anymore, where the bus lines no longer run as frequently and the like. There's clear evidence that is closely connected to support for, parties on both the far right and the far left, but especially the far right.
I'll give you one concrete example from the current German government. I mean, in the coalition treaty, it says we want to build 400,000 flats a year. Right. So, and that's not an outrageous number. In the 1970s, there were on average more than 400,000 flats being built per year. The target has been widely missed, and flats is, if you link this to the discussion we had before about uncertainty, and housing is one of the key elements about certainty about the future. So it is not an outrageous target. It's been missed by a country mile. Some commentators say it's about interest rate. Well, it's not about interest rates because even in the prolonged period of low interest rates, building construction has been way below the average over the decades. So it has to be something else. But it's that kind of not delivering on key promises that is also undermining in the policy area. So that needs to become better. But my hunch is that this on its own won't be enough. It might be one step in order to try to reestablish a bit of credibility and actually to establish the notion the government actually can affect change for the positive. But then the task is, what else can you offer in order to turn this around? And if I understand you correctly, it's about a political idea, a political vision that actually gives people a little bit of confidence about the future, and reduces that idea of uncertainty or anxiety about the future.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, it's easier to say that than to do it, of course. But there's a way in which a talented political leadership is really crucial here. I think that one of the mistaken ideas is that the way to deal with this kind of discontent is to provide more generous social benefits. I think generous social benefits are important. People need, what we're facing is a set of risks. This uncertainty about the future has to do with the kind of risks that people are facing, and social insurance of various kinds is a way of cushioning the effects of those risks. And so that's important. But I think what a lot of people really want are decent jobs. And that is very hard to deliver. The Biden in the U.S. is trying to do that with his Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, these subsidies to produce manufacturing jobs. But really the number of jobs they're producing or likely to produce is relatively small relative to the demand. So it's very, very hard for governments to kind of create decent jobs. I think what they need to focus on is making existing jobs more decent. We're talking about minimum wage laws, living wage. We're talking about support of the sort we see in the flexicurity system of Denmark and to some extent Sweden, making it possible for people, if they lose one job, to move to another, limiting these on-demand hours type of contracts. And I think governments can do that. I don't think it's going to entirely solve the problem at all, because we are living in the midst of a new technological revolution. We are facing uncertainty, and that uncertainty isn't going to go away. But if governments can supplement their social insurance with measures that sometimes are not so costly, but rather regulatory rather than spending measures, to ensure that the jobs, even of those who are on the lower rungs of the social ladder, though that their jobs are nonetheless decent jobs, I think that would go some distance in the relevant direction. But there's no question this is a huge political challenge. I don't think there are any easy answers, even for the most talented politicians. It's a huge political challenge.
I mean, to some extent, this is what Olaf Scholz managed to pull off in the last election campaign, right? So the notion was respect for the people who deliver, who might not be in the best paid jobs, but to keep the country running. It's the nurses, it's the manual workers, it's all the people contributing to society in so many ways without which society would basically collapse, but who often don't get the recognition that they deserve. So that was so part of the recipe 4 years ago. So we'll see how it goes next time around. So Peter, thank you very much again for agreeing to talk to me about these issues, and hopefully in 7 years' time we can talk about how it's all been resolved.
It's my pleasure, Henning. Thank you very much for having me.